Okay, so for my RTI project, I am utilizing a daily behavior report card to increase on task behaviors in a digital classroom. So the purpose was to increase student retention and attrition when learning in an online setting. I want to decrease the off task behaviors of students with an SLD in the online classroom setting by altering their target behaviors. Um, I want to know what will the response be if a student with an SLD is placed on an individualized behavioral contract to improve their time on task during online instruction. There are several considerations that need to be accounted for. The non traditional classroom, which is anything outside of a regular school building. And if the student is on an IEP, some more is the SLD refers to a student with ADHD or hyperactivity disorder. Some of the behaviors that I'm defining as on task and off task being the desired behaviors, active participation, engaged in material, remaining seated while working on the lesson material, off task behaviors being the target behavior for the intervention, out of their seat, on websites not needed for the lesson, daydreaming, and starting the lesson late. Some more considerations: the demographic population of my students. I teach a seventh grade resource room, so I have math and English students as well as the online students, and there are 12 total. And all of those students have an IEP. So some of the literature that I chose, uh, here we have the advantages and disadvantages of using a daily behavioral report card, being that the advantages are increased communication between the parents and the teachers, minimal effort and no training required. The main disadvantage being that they require a lot of parental involvement. The next thing I found was specifically dealing with students who have an ADHD or hyperactivity disorder. Um, in special education, here we use daily behavior report cards as a progress monitoring tool for behavioral goals in the classroom as well as out of the classroom. Basically, they found that it's you're able to keep more frequent progress reports of those students and their behaviors. And then finally, dealing with students who have difficulty in a traditional classroom setting, so that they are at home during that time placement. Here, the student deals with ADHD, hyperactivity, and SLD, and it is used to improve his behavior while also improving his academic behavior. This study in particular found that it was effective and efficient in curving that student's academic performance as well as his behavior in that setting. So the procedures that I used two procedures. I have two phases. I have an observational and parental feedback in both phase. A is my pre-intervention and B is my after or post-intervention. It was done in a time frame that was 5 total days or one school week, and then one 50-minute period, and broken down into 10-minute intervals. So 5 total observational data points for my A and B phase. The student that I'm being particularly looking at is a 13-year-old seventh grade student who has ADHD, and then some of the characteristics that that student represents. I selected the students based on if they were in the resource room as a placement. They have additional online learning for their core classes, such as English and math. They have ADHD or ADD. They are in a current IEP, or they show a trend of consistent off task behavior. The pretest baseline data was collected through independent observation while the student worked on their classroom material in the home setting. So it was done in a 10-minute increment for 50-minute total, so 5 total data points. That was then recorded in a spreadsheet and which documented all their off-task behaviors. The outcomes that I'm trying to measure are that the student will decrease their off-task behaviors while working in the online class setting. It measures the frequency of the off-task behaviors before and after the behavioral intervention has been introduced. My measurement techniques, I'm trying to catch the frequency of the observation. So the student, like I said, 10 minutes for a 50-minute period weekly, and the student behaviors are recorded in the online spreadsheet. The administering parties are the parents who are watching the behaviors for the student who are at home, and then the intervention specialist monitors the academic progress that the student is making on a daily basis. Some of the precautions, I want it to be done consistently over the same time period, daily. And then the on and off task behaviors are discussed with the intervention specialist, parent, and student all present so that they all know what's expected for everyone. Some more precautions. This is taken after the annual IEP review once the identified behaviors have been represented and can be targeted. And then I'm going to get into what the on and off task behaviors are. So my methodology. This is an example of the data collection that I used. You'll see from 10 o'clock to 10:50, the parent was to identify whether the student was on task or off task based off of their behavior. So they would put a Y or an N. And then they would count the amount of Ys or times on task, and that would reflect in the 1 through 5 down at the bottom. The bottom left is the targeted behavior. In the bottom right, this parent would initial it and then send it back. Each sheet covered 2 days. Here's an example done on March 11th and March 12th. You'll notice that there are 3 Ys for March 11th and then 3 Ys for March 12th. Therefore, the parent checkmarked the 3, which would indicate that there were 3 times they were observed on task. And then they initialed it and sent it back to the school. So the daily behavioral report, they're given that rating 1 through 5 for a 50-minute period. And then during each 10-minute observational time, either the yes or the no are tallied, which is then reflected in that 1 through 5. The interventions were done as an independent observation and then also on the daily behavior report card itself. The observations were done in the non-traditional setting, which takes place in the home, and then they were done in a weekly fashion. So once every day for 5 days, and then reported back to the teacher where the teacher, myself, would record the data. So the results. The results were meant to reflect if the student needs to make improvement, if intervention is needed, if extenuating circumstances existed that would lead to outliers such as issues at home, sickness, or lack of medication. And then like I said, the daily report cards are a 1 to 5 score. If the student was able to meet 80%, which would be 20 out of 25 for the 5 days that they were observed, they were given a reward as an at-home privilege, an at-school privilege, or verbal praise. The privileges range from online access, free time, extra treats, stuff like that. Here's a summary of the data that I collected. The blue is the baseline data, and the red is the after the behavioral intervention was introduced. So you'll see that there's a clear trend for the baseline that the student was unable to eclipse being on task 3 out of the 5 times, whereas after the behavioral intervention was introduced, the student eclipsed that and was observed on task far more often for those 50-minute time periods. So before the intervention was introduced, the student was averaging 2 times on task in the 10-minute increments. And they were more likely off task towards the end of that 50-minute observational period. After the intervention was introduced, however, the student was observed on task an average of 4.4 times during the 5 10-minute increments for a 5-day observation. This is a far improvement from the 2.0 that was represented in the baseline data. So students who were given the daily behavioral report card responded positively when they were given rewards for their behavior. Also, the students also wanted to see themselves score higher, so it kind of offered its own intrinsic motivation for that student. Also, the area between 10:30 and 10:40, which was the second to last observational block, where the student was struggling the most, we saw an improvement in those scores during that time period. So the visual representation of the behavior and the motivation to receive a higher score as well as the reward for staying off task, probably played a major role in that improvement. Some questions for further research: independent observer bias. So is the parent involved? Is the parent at home? Is the parent, paying attention? Are there other distractions, like another small child or a pet that distracts the student? These are things that need to be taken into effect. Also, if there was a longer study, then we could do a more intense intervention strategy for that student, as well as collecting more data to help that student alter those behaviors in that setting. Some things that might be used for further research are computer monitoring programs such as GoGuardian. This is a monitoring program to where the teacher can see the student's screen as well as how much time they are spending per problem. And that way they can know if the student is on a different website, if is the student, making progress in their lessons. And that's just something that could be used in a future study. And then finally, here are my references that are being used. And I would like to thank you. And that is the end of my